Picture this. You're a medieval soldier standing on the walls of your fortress, watching enemy forces approach. Suddenly, something flies through the air toward you, but it's not a stone, it's not fire. It's the severed head of your commanding officer, hurled from a massive wooden machine with terrifying precision. This actually happened, not once, but dozens of times throughout history. Welcome to the darkest chapter of medieval warfare, where siege engines became instruments of psychological terror and human heads became ammunition. The year is 1346. The Black Death ravages Europe, but in the Crimean port city of Kaffa, something even more sinister is unfolding. Mongol forces have surrounded the Genoese trading post for months. Disease spreads through their ranks like wildfire. But instead of retreating, the Mongol commander makes a decision that will echo through the corridors of history forever. He orders his engineers to load the trebuchets, not with stones, not with firepots, but with the plague-ridden corpses of his own fallen soldiers. This wasn't just warfare. This was biological terrorism, medieval style. And it worked. The defenders, horrified and infected, eventually fled. Some historians believe this single act helped spread the Black Death into Europe, ultimately killing 1/3 of the continent's population. But human projectiles weren't invented at Kaffa. They have a much darker, much longer history. The practice dates back to ancient times, but it reached its most sophisticated and terrifying form during the medieval period. The weapon of choice? The trebuchet, a massive siege engine that could hurl objects weighing up to 300 pounds over distances of 400 yards with devastating accuracy. Imagine standing before one of these machines. It towers above you, sometimes reaching heights of 60 feet. Its wooden frame creaks ominously in the wind. The counterweight alone weighs several tons. When released, it falls with the force of gravity, launching whatever sits in the throwing arm with tremendous velocity. Now imagine that projectile is human. The psychology behind this practice was as calculated as it was cruel. Medieval commanders understood something that modern military strategists still study today. Fear can be more powerful than any weapon. A castle wall might withstand 1,000 stone projectiles, but throw a single human head over those walls, and you've struck at something much deeper than stone and mortar. You've struck at the human spirit. To understand how human heads became medieval ammunition, we need to understand the trebuchet itself. This wasn't some crude catapult cobbled together by desperate soldiers. The trebuchet was engineering genius, a masterpiece of medieval technology that took months to construct and required teams of skilled craftsmen. The largest trebuchets were architectural marvels. The framework was built from massive oak beams, some as thick as tree trunks. The throwing arm could be 60 feet long, carefully balanced and reinforced with iron bands. The counterweight system was a work of art in itself, often housed in an ornate wooden box that could hold up to 20 tons of stone, lead, and pottery, or sand. But here's where it gets truly unsettling. To launch human projectiles effectively, engineers had to solve unique problems. A stone is predictable. It has consistent weight and density. A human body or head is different. It's irregularly shaped, has varying density, and decomposes over time, changing its ballistic properties. Medieval engineers developed specialized techniques for human projectiles. Bodies were sometimes wrapped in leather or cloth to maintain structural integrity during flight. Heads were occasionally placed in specially designed baskets or nets to ensure they would survive the launch and land intact, maximizing their psychological impact. The loading process itself was a ritual of terror. Soldiers would hoist the human cargo using ropes and pulleys, positioning it carefully in the throwing cup. The counterweight would be raised, tension building in every rope and beam. Then, with a command that must have sent chills down every spine present, the trebuchet would release its gruesome payload. The physics are as fascinating as they are horrifying. A well-tuned trebuchet could launch a human head at speeds exceeding 150 miles per hour. The projectile would follow a perfect parabolic arc, sailing over walls that might be 50 feet high, landing with devastating accuracy in courtyards, markets, or living quarters. But perhaps the most chilling aspect was the preparation. Someone had to collect these human projectiles. Someone had to prepare them. Someone had to load them. And someone had to give the order to fire. The year is 1428. The 100 Years' War rages between England and France. English forces surround the strategic city of Orléans, the key to controlling the Loire Valley and potentially all of France. The siege will last 7 months and become one of the most documented examples of psychological warfare in medieval history. Contemporary accounts describe scenes that seem ripped from a nightmare. English trebuchets didn't just launch stones and fire pots into the city. They launched the heads of captured French soldiers, the bodies of executed prisoners, and even more disturbing cargo that chroniclers of the time dared not describe in detail. One particularly harrowing account comes from the journal of a French defender named Jean de Taverny. He writes about a morning when English trebuchets launched what appeared to be ordinary supply bundles. But when these bundles landed in the market square, they split open to reveal the severed limbs of French soldiers, along with taunting messages written on parchment and tied with ribbons. The psychological warfare was systematic and calculated. English commanders understood that Orléans wasn't just a military target, it was a symbol. If Orléans fell, French morale across the entire kingdom would collapse. So they didn't just attack the city's walls, they attacked its spirit. The defenders' responses reveal the true impact of this terror campaign. City records show that civilian morale plummeted within weeks of the siege beginning. Food riots broke out, not because of hunger, but because of fear. People refused to venture into open areas where the gruesome projectiles might land. Children stopped playing in courtyards. Markets closed early. But then something extraordinary happened. A peasant girl named Joan claimed to have received visions from God, commanding her to drive out the English. Whether you believe in divine intervention or not, Joan of Arc's arrival marked a turning point in the siege. Her very presence seemed to counteract the English terror campaign. Morale soared. Defenders who had cowered in fear suddenly fought with renewed vigor. The siege ended with a French victory, but the psychological scars remained. Survivors of Orléans reported nightmares for years afterward. Some claimed to wake up screaming about heads falling from the sky like rain. Why did launching human heads work so effectively as psychological warfare? To understand this, we need to delve into the medieval mind and the primal fears that drive human behavior. Medieval society was deeply religious, and the concept of bodily integrity was sacred. Christians believed in physical resurrection, meaning the body needed to remain intact for the afterlife. When commanders launched severed heads into enemy cities, they weren't just causing fear. They were committing what medieval people viewed as a crime against God and nature. But there's something even deeper at work here. Modern psychologists have identified a phenomenon called terror management theory. When humans are confronted with reminders of their own mortality, especially in graphic, unexpected ways, their psychological defenses can completely collapse. A severed head flying through the air and landing in your living space is perhaps the most visceral mortality reminder imaginable. Medieval chroniclers document symptoms we would recognize today as severe trauma. Defenders exposed to human projectile attacks showed signs of what we now call PTSD. They reported difficulty sleeping, loss of appetite, excessive startle responses, and intrusive thoughts about death and dismemberment. The terror was amplified by uncertainty. Defenders never knew when the next gruesome projectile might arrive. This unpredictability is a key component of psychological warfare. The human mind struggles to cope with threats that have no pattern, no way to prepare or defend. Consider this: a stone projectile damages buildings and kills unlucky individuals struck directly. But a human head projectile terrorizes entire populations. It spreads fear like a contagion, affecting people who weren't even present when it landed. Medieval accounts describe how news of human projectile attacks would spread through cities like wildfire, causing panic in neighborhoods that hadn't even been tar. The visual impact was equally important. Medieval people lived with death as a constant presence, but they had rituals and customs to manage it. Bodies were prepared, blessed, and buried according to strict protocols. A severed head launched from a trebuchet violated every social and religious norm about how death should be handled. It was chaos in its purest form. Behind every terror campaign was a mind that conceived it. Medieval siege engineers weren't just builders and mathematicians. Some became specialists in psychological warfare, developing increasingly sophisticated methods for maximizing fear and horror. One of the most notorious was a man known only as Master Guillaume in French chronicles. He served various lords during the 14th century and gained a reputation for innovative cruelty. Guillaume didn't just launch human heads. He developed what chroniclers called speaking projectiles. These were specially prepared packages that would burst open upon impact, revealing not just human remains, but messages, threats, and sometimes even personal items taken from captured enemies. Imagine defending a castle and having a trebuchet launch the severed head of your brother, along with a letter describing exactly how he died, and a threat that you would suffer the same fate. Guillaume's innovations didn't stop there. He developed timed releases, using slow-burning fuses to create projectiles that would explode in mid-air, spreading human remains across a wider area. He experimented with different wrapping materials to ensure maximum visual impact upon landing. He even tested various preservation techniques to ensure human heads would remain recognizable after several days of preparation and launch. But Guillaume's most horrifying innovation was what he called message heads. He would carve words directly into the faces of severed heads, creating grotesque messages that would be clearly visible to anyone who found them. Contemporary accounts describe heads with "surrender" carved into foreheads, or "your turn next" etched into cheeks. The engineering challenges were significant. Human tissue decomposes rapidly, especially in warm weather. Guillaume and engineers like him had to solve problems of preservation, weight distribution, and aerodynamics. They developed special chambers for storing human projectiles, techniques for maintaining structural integrity during launch, and methods for calculating trajectory adjustments based on decomposition rates. These weren't mad scientists. They were educated, skilled professionals who applied scientific principles to psychological warfare. Their work was studied, refined, and passed down through generations of military engineers. Some even wrote treatises on the subject. complete with diagrams and mathematical formulas. ... As terrible as launching severed heads sounds, it was just the beginning. Medieval siege warfare developed variations on human projectiles that pushed the boundaries of human cruelty to unimaginable extremes. Living projectiles were perhaps the most horrifying innovation. Contemporary accounts from the siege of Kaffa described Mongol forces launching not just plague victims' corpses, but prisoners who were still alive. The trebuchet's throwing mechanism was modified with nets or cages that could contain a living person during launch, though survival upon impact was extremely rare. The psychological impact of watching living humans launched through the air can barely be comprehended. Defenders would see fellow human beings flying overhead, screaming until impact. The trauma was immediate and lasting. Several medieval chronicles report that some defenders went permanently insane after witnessing such attacks. Another variation involved compound projectiles. Engineers would combine multiple human heads in single launches, sometimes arranging them to create grotesque displays upon landing. One account from the Siege of Harfleur describes a projectile containing 7 heads arranged in the shape of a flower, with a written message placed in the center. Perhaps most disturbing were the personalized attacks. Medieval warfare was personal. Nobles knew their enemies by name and face. Siege engineers capitalized on this by launching the heads of specific individuals known to defenders. Imagine defending your family castle and watching your father's severed head arc through the sky, landing in the courtyard where you played as a child. The preparation rituals for these attacks were equally horrifying. Some siege camps developed entire production lines for processing human projectiles. Bodies would be systematically dismembered, with different parts allocated for different types of attacks. Heads were prepared for maximum visual impact. Limbs were bundled for area effect terror. Torsos were sometimes filled with additional gruesome materials before launch. Religious mockery was another layer of psychological warfare. Christian enemies would launch heads during religious holidays or arrange to land near churches and chapels. Muslim forces facing Christian defenders would launch pork-filled packages along with human remains, combining physical and spiritual defilement in single attacks. The logistics were staggering. Major sieges could last months, requiring steady supplies of human projectiles. This meant not just collecting enemy dead, but sometimes executing prisoners specifically to maintain ammunition supplies. Some siege camps established dedicated facilities for processing and storing human remains, complete with preservation techniques and quality control measures. We return now to that fateful siege at Kaffa in 1346, because what happened there changed the course of human history. The Mongol use of plague corpses as projectiles wasn't just psychological warfare. It was biological warfare on a scale that wouldn't be seen again until the 20th century. The Black Death was already devastating the Mongol army. Soldiers were dying by the hundreds daily. But instead of retreating, the Mongol commander Janibek made a decision that demonstrated medieval military thinking at its most ruthlessly pragmatic. If his men were going to die anyway, their deaths would serve a purpose. The logistics of biological warfare using trebuchets were complex. Plague victims had to be collected quickly after death, while the bacteria remained viable. They had to be loaded and launched before advanced decomposition set in. Timing was everything. Contemporary accounts describe the Genoese defenders' horror as corpse after corpse rained down on their city. But horror quickly turned to terror as the disease began spreading among the population. Within weeks, the The same plague that was killing Mongol soldiers was killing Genoese traders, their families, and anyone else inside the city walls. The Genoese who survived the initial plague outbreak fled by ship, inadvertently carrying the disease to Constantinople, then to Sicily, then to the Italian mainland. From there, the Black Death spread across Europe like wildfire, ultimately killing an estimated 75 to 200 million people. Think about that for a moment. One military commander's decision to use human corpses as siege ammunition may have triggered the most devastating pandemic in European history. The trebuchets at Kaffa didn't just launch dead bodies. They launched the collapse of medieval civilization as it existed. But here's the truly chilling part. The biological warfare aspect may have been intentional. Recent analysis of Mongol military documents suggests their commanders understood disease transmission better than previously thought. They knew that corpses could spread sickness. They knew that launching infected bodies into enemy cities would cause epidemics. This wasn't just desperate cruelty. It was calculated biological warfare using trebuchets as delivery systems. The implications were staggering. If medieval armies could weaponize disease using siege engines, why didn't they do it more often? The answer lies in medieval military culture. Using disease as a weapon was considered dishonorable, even by medieval standards. It violated codes of chivalry and military conduct that most European commanders still respected. The Mongols, however, operated under different cultural rules. For them, victory justified any means. If launching plague corpses would break a siege and save Mongol lives, it was not just acceptable, but strategic brilliance. What do you do when enemy trebuchets start launching human heads into your city? Medieval defenders faced an impossible psychological challenge with no clear solutions. The first response was always horror and revulsion. Contemporary accounts consistently describe the initial shock when human projectiles began falling from the sky. Trained soldiers, people accustomed to medieval warfare's brutality, were completely unprepared for this level of psychological assault. Some defenders tried to normalize the experience. They would collect the human remains and dispose of them quickly, trying to minimize their psychological impact on the population. But this approach had its own problems. Who volunteers to collect severed heads? How do you dispose of human remains during a siege when resources are limited and space is confined? Other defenders tried counter-psychological warfare. If the enemy was launching human heads, they would launch human heads back. Several siege accounts describe macabre exchanges where both sides hurled severed heads back and forth for days, creating a grotesque tennis match played with human remains. But perhaps the most effective defense was spiritual. Medieval people turned to religion when faced with horrors beyond human comprehension. Prayer services increased. Religious processions became more frequent. Some cities organized mass exorcisms, treating the human projectile attacks as demonic assaults rather than military tactics. The psychological toll on defenders was enormous and well documented. Medieval physicians wrote about a condition they called siege madness, characterized by symptoms we would now recognize as severe PTSD. Defenders would become catatonic, refuse to eat, or engage in self-destructive behaviors. Children were particularly vulnerable. Several accounts describe children who stopped speaking after witnessing human projectile attacks. Others developed what medieval chroniclers called head fever, obsessive fears that severed heads would fall from the sky at any moment. The social fabric of besieged cities began unraveling under this psychological pressure. Normal social hierarchies collapsed when everyone faced the same random terror from above. Nobles and peasants alike could be killed or traumatized by falling human heads. Traditional leadership structures proved inadequate for managing this level of psychological warfare. Some cities developed early warning systems, posting lookouts to watch for incoming projectiles and shout warnings. But this created its own problems. Constant vigilance was exhausting, and false alarms caused additional panic. The most successful defense strategies combined practical and spiritual elements. Cities that survived lengthy human projectile bombardments typically had strong religious leadership that helped manage population morale while implementing practical measures for quick disposal of gruesome ammunition. As psychological siege warfare evolved, so did the engineering behind it. Medieval trebuchet designers became increasingly sophisticated in their approach to human projectiles, developing specialized equipment and techniques that sound like something from a nightmare. The standard trebuchet design had to be modified for human cargo. Stone projectiles were dense and predictable. Human bodies and heads had different weight distributions, aerodynamic properties, and structural integrity issues. Engineers had to compensate for these variables to maintain accuracy. Specialized throwing cups were developed specifically for human projectiles. These were often basket-like containers that could hold irregularly shaped cargo while ensuring proper release timing. Some designs included breakaway sections that would open upon impact, maximizing the visual spread of human remains. Loading mechanisms evolved as well. Standard trebuchets used simple cradles or slings for stone ammunition. Human projectiles required more complex loading systems to position cargo properly and ensure structural integrity during launch. Some siege engines incorporated multiple throwing cups, allowing for rapid-fire launches of human heads. The counterweight systems were adjusted for different projectile weights, but human head weighs significantly less than a stone of similar size, requiring mathematical recalculations of the entire trebuchet's balance and timing. Medieval engineers developed conversion charts for adjusting their machines based on different types of human cargo. Range and accuracy improvements were critical for psychological effectiveness. A human head that missed its target had minimal impact. But a human head that landed precisely in a crowded market or nobleman's courtyard was psychologically devastating. Engineers refined their calculations to achieve pinpoint accuracy with irregular projectiles. Storage and preparation facilities became increasingly sophisticated. Major sieges required steady supplies of human ammunition, leading to the development of specialized preparation areas. These facilities included preservation techniques, quality control measures, and efficient processing procedures that sound disturbingly similar to modern industrial practices. Some engineers developed what they called presentation techniques. Human heads weren't just launched randomly. They were prepared to maximize visual impact, sometimes decorated or modified to create specific psychological effects. Hair might be styled in particular ways. Facial expressions might be artificially arranged. Messages could be carved into Cs. The engineering knowledge was carefully guarded and passed down through generations. Master siege engineers commanded high salaries, partly because of their technical expertise in conventional warfare, but also because of their specialized knowledge in psychological terror campaigns. Even in an age known for its brutality, using human heads as ammunition crossed lines that troubled medieval consciences. Religious leaders, military theorists, and even some commanders began questioning whether such tactics were morally justifiable, even in war. The Catholic Church's position was complex and evolving. Early church doctrine focused primarily on just war theory, which emphasized that warfare should be conducted with restraint and honor. Launching human heads clearly violated these principles, but the church struggled with how to respond to an increasingly brutal military reality. Some bishops declared that using human projectiles was not just militarily dishonorable, but spiritually damning. They argued that defiling the human body, especially the head, which housed the soul, was a sin against God's creation. Soldiers who participated in such campaigns were sometimes refused confession or communion, but other church leaders took a more pragmatic approach. If Christian armies faced enemies who used these tactics, they argued, Christian defenders had the right to respond in kind. Self-defense justified otherwise unchristian actions. This theological debate created deep divisions within medieval Christianity. Military codes of chivalry were similarly conflicted. The chivalric ideal emphasized honor, courage, and protection of the innocent. Launching severed heads into cities clearly violated these principles. But chivalry also emphasized victory and protection of one's own people. If terror tactics could end a siege quickly and save Christian lives, were they justifiable? Some knights refused to participate in human projectile campaigns, even at the cost of their military careers. Others rationalized their participation as necessary evil in service of greater good. These moral compromises created lasting psychological damage that extended far beyond the immediate military scene. The long-term effects on military culture were profound. Once the taboo against using human projectiles was broken, other previously unthinkable tactics became acceptable. Siege warfare became increasingly brutal throughout the late medieval period, with each campaign trying to outdo the last in terms of psychological terror. Contemporary chroniclers struggled with how to record these events. Some provided detailed accounts, apparently believing that future generations needed to understand the full horror of what had occurred. Others deliberately omitted the most disturbing details, either from decency or from fear that their accounts might inspire similar atrocities. The moral reckoning extended to civilian populations as well. People who survived human projectile attacks often reported feeling spiritually contaminated. They had witnessed violations of natural law that challenged their fundamental beliefs about human dignity and divine order. Modern psychology and military science have given us new insights into why medieval human projectile campaigns were so devastatingly effective. The techniques developed by medieval commanders accidentally pioneered principles that wouldn't be formally studied until the 20th century. Terror management theory explains why severed heads were such effective psychological weapons. When humans are confronted with graphic reminders of their mortality, especially in unexpected contexts, their normal psychological defenses can completely collapse. A human head flying through the air and landing in a peaceful courtyard creates what psychologists call mortality salience shock. The randomness factor was equally important. Modern military psychologists understand that unpredictable threats are far more psychologically damaging than consistent ones. Defenders could prepare for regular stone bombardments, developing routines and defenses that helped them cope psychologically. But they could never predict when or where human heads might land, creating constant anxiety and hypervigilance. Medieval siege engineers also accidentally discovered principles of psychological conditioning. By mixing human projectiles with conventional ammunition, they created what modern psychologists call intermittent reinforcement schedules. Defenders never knew whether incoming projectiles would be stones, fire pots, or severed heads. This uncertainty maximized anxiety and prevented psychological adaptation. The social contagion effects were particularly sophisticated. Medieval commanders understood that fear spreads through populations, like disease. A single human head landing in a public space would terrorize not just direct witnesses, but anyone who heard about it secondhand. Stories would spread and amplify, often becoming more horrifying in the retelling. Visual imagery played a crucial role. Medieval people were highly visual learners, relying on images and symbols to understand their world. A severed head wasn't just a physical object. It was a symbol of mortality, defeat, and cosmic disorder. The image would become burned into witnesses' memories, creating lasting psychological trauma. The targeting was psychologically sophisticated as well. Medieval commanders didn't launch human heads randomly. They aimed for markets, churches, and noble residences, spaces associated with safety, commerce, and social order. By violating these sacred spaces, they attacked the fundamental assumptions that allowed medieval society to function. Modern military studies of psychological warfare consistently rank unpredictable biological threats as among the most effective terror tactics. Medieval siege engineers had discovered this principle through trial and error, developing techniques that modern armies still study and, thankfully, mostly avoid using. By the late 15th century, the practice of using human projectiles in siege warfare began to decline, but not because medieval commanders suddenly developed moral scruples. The reasons were primarily technological and strategic. Gunpowder artillery was revolutionizing siege warfare. Cannons could breach castle walls faster and more efficiently than trebuchets. The lengthy psychological campaigns that made human projectiles effective became unnecessary when you could simply blow holes in enemy fortifications and storm through them. The changing nature of medieval warfare also contributed to the decline. Professional armies were replacing feudal levies. Professional soldiers were more psychologically resilient than civilian militias and less susceptible to terror tactics. The target audience for psychological warfare was evolving in ways that made traditional terror techniques less effective. Political changes mattered as well. The rise of centralized nation-states meant that local sieges became less decisive. A single castle or city falling to terror tactics couldn't determine the outcome of entire campaigns. The strategic value of psychological warfare diminished as the scale of medieval conflicts expanded. But the most important factor was probably the spread of literacy and communication. In earlier medieval periods, horrific siege tactics could be contained geographically. Stories of human projectile attacks might spread locally, but wouldn't necessarily influence distant military campaigns. By the late medieval period, news traveled faster and farther. Commanders who used terror tactics faced potential diplomatic consequences and retaliation that outweighed any military advantages. The legacy of human projectile warfare extends far beyond medieval battlefields. The techniques developed by medieval siege engineers laid groundwork for later developments in psychological warfare. The principles they discovered, unpredictability, mortality salience, social contagion, symbolic violation, remain fundamental to modern military psychological operations. World War I propaganda posters, World War II psychological warfare campaigns, and modern terrorist tactics all employ principles that medieval trebuchet operators would recognize. The delivery methods have changed, but the underlying psychology remains the same. Perhaps most importantly, medieval human projectile warfare established precedents for biological warfare that influenced military thinking for centuries. The plague bombardment at Kaffa wasn't just a medieval atrocity. It was a proof of concept that disease could be weaponized and deployed using available technology. Modern archaeology has provided disturbing confirmation of medieval chronicles' accounts of human projectile warfare. Excavations at siege sites across Europe have uncovered evidence that brings these historical horrors into sharp focus. At the site of medieval Carcassonne in southern France, archaeologists have found mass graves containing human remains with distinctive trauma patterns. Many skulls show evidence of high-velocity impacts consistent with trebuchet launches. The scatter patterns of these remains suggest they were indeed used as projectiles rather than simply dying during conventional combat. Perhaps most disturbing are the finds at Chateau Gaillard, Richard the Lionheart's fortress in Normandy. Excavations in the castle courtyard revealed multiple human skulls buried in a single layer, suggesting they all arrived at roughly the same time. Impact fractures and the positioning of the remains strongly suggest these were launched projectiles rather than battle casual. Carbon dating of human remains found at various siege sites has revealed the systematic nature of these campaigns. At some locations, archaeologists have found evidence of human projectile attacks spanning months or even years, indicating that this wasn't desperate improvisation, but sustained military strategy. The preservation of organic materials at some sites has provided even more disturbing evidence. Leather wrappings found with human remains show clear signs of having been used to package human heads for trebuchet launch. The stitching patterns and reinforcement techniques match descriptions found in medieval siege engineering treatises. Chemical analysis of soil samples from siege sites has revealed elevated levels of decomposition products in specific areas, consistent with repeated impacts of organic projectiles. These findings support historical accounts of dedicated impact zones where human projectiles were systematically targeted. Archaeological evidence has also confirmed the scale of these operations. At the siege site of Harfleur, excavations have uncovered what appears to be a medieval processing facility where human remains were prepared for use as projectiles. The site contains specialized tools, preparation tables, and disposal pits that match descriptions from contemporary accounts. Perhaps most chilling are the discoveries of carved human skulls. These archaeological finds confirm medieval accounts of message heads, skulls that were carved with threats or taunts before being launched. The carving techniques and tool marks provide insights into the systematic nature of these psychological warfare campaigns. DNA analysis of human remains from siege sites has revealed that victims came from diverse populations, suggesting that both enemy soldiers and civilians were used as ammunition. This evidence supports historical accounts of the indiscriminate nature of medieval psychological warfare. How do we, in the 21st century, make sense of medieval warfare's darkest chapters? Modern military historians, psychologists, and ethicists have struggled to understand both the effectiveness and the horror of human projectile campaigns. Contemporary military analysis recognizes that medieval siege engineers accidentally discovered principles of psychological warfare that remain relevant today. The techniques they developed for maximizing terror and breaking enemy morale are still studied in military academies, though thankfully not for replication. Modern trauma psychology provides new insights into the long-term effects of these campaigns. Survivors of human projectile attacks showed symptoms that we now recognize as severe PTSD, generational trauma, and what psychologists call moral injury. Psychological damage that occurs when people witness violations of fundamental moral principles. The study of medieval terror tactics has influenced modern military ethics and international law. The Geneva Convention's provisions against using human remains in warfare trace directly back to medieval precedents. The prohibition against biological warfare similarly reflects lessons learned from campaigns like the Siege of Kaffa. But perhaps the most important modern insight is recognition that medieval human projectile warfare wasn't an aberration. It was a logical evolution of military thinking in societies that prioritized victory over humanitarian concerns. Understanding this history helps us recognize similar patterns in modern conflicts and work to prevent them. Contemporary military psychologists have studied the long-term effects of terror campaigns on both victims and perpetrators. Soldiers who participated in human projectile operations often suffered psychological damage similar to their victims. Modern studies of war crimes have revealed that perpetrators of atrocities frequently develop lasting trauma from their own actions. The democratization of information in the modern era has made terror tactics like human projectile warfare less strategically viable. Medieval campaigns could be contained geographically and temporally. Modern atrocities face immediate global scrutiny and condemnation that outweighs any tactical advantages. Modern siege warfare has largely eliminated the psychological component that made human projectile campaigns effective. Professional armies, rapid communications, and technological advantages have reduced the importance of terror tactics in determining siege outcomes. Behind every statistical account of medieval siege warfare lie individual human stories of unimaginable trauma and suffering. The human cost of projectile warfare extended far beyond immediate casualties to encompass entire communities and generations. Contemporary medical accounts provide disturbing insights into the psychological aftermath of human projectile attacks. Medieval physicians developed specialized treatments for what they called head fever and siege madness, conditions we now recognize as severe trauma responses. Children who survived these attacks often never fully recovered. Medieval chronicles describe children who stopped speaking, refused to eat, or developed obsessive behaviors related to death and dismemberment. Some became catatonic, unable to function in normal social settings. Women bore particular psychological burdens in these campaigns. Medieval gender roles meant that women were often responsible for managing households and caring for children during sieges, all while coping with the trauma of human projectiles landing in their living spaces. The social fabric of communities subjected to prolonged human projectile campaigns often never fully healed. Trust between neighbors eroded when anyone might be the next victim. Normal social activities became impossible when people lived in constant fear of gruesome death falling from the sky. Religious faith, which provided psychological anchors for most medieval people, was often shattered by exposure to human projectile warfare. How do you maintain faith in divine order when severed heads rain from heaven? Many survivors reported lasting spiritual crises that affected their entire worldview. The economic costs were staggering as well. Communities subjected to psychological siege warfare often never fully recovered economically. Trade relationships were disrupted, agricultural production declined, and population losses created labor shortages that lasted for generations. Intergenerational trauma was common among survivor families. Parents who had witnessed human projectile attacks often developed overprotective behaviors that limited their children's development. Stories of the attacks were passed down through families, creating lasting psychological impacts on people who had never directly experienced the original trauma. Modern historians continue to debate controversial theories about the true impact and significance of medieval human projectile warfare. These debates reveal ongoing disagreements about how to interpret some of history's darkest chapters. One controversial theory suggests that human projectile warfare was far more common than historical records indicate. Proponents argue that many medieval chroniclers deliberately omitted accounts of these attacks, either from moral revulsion or fear that their descriptions might inspire copycat campaigns. If true, this would mean our understanding of medieval warfare is incomplete in fundamental ways. Another disputed theory proposes that the plague outbreak following the siege of Kaffa was not primarily caused by trebuchet-launched corpses, but by other transmission vectors. Critics argue that plague bacteria couldn't survive trebuchet launch, and that the biological warfare aspect has been exaggerated by later historians seeking dramatic explanations for the Black Death's spread. Some historians challenge the effectiveness claims surrounding human projectile campaigns. They argue that medieval people were accustomed to brutal death and dismemberment, making them less susceptible to psychological warfare than commonly believed. This theory suggests that accounts of terror effectiveness were exaggerated by chroniclers for literary impact. A particularly controversial theory suggests that some human projectile campaigns targeted civilian populations deliberately, making them early examples of what modern international law defines as crimes against humanity. This interpretation has implications for how we understand the evolution of warfare ethics and international legal standards. Other historians dispute the technological capabilities of medieval trebuchets for human projectile warfare. They argue that the engineering challenges of launching irregular human cargo accurately have been underestimated, and that many supposed human projectile attacks were actually conventional ammunition, misidentified by traumatized witnesses. Recent archaeological discoveries have reignited debates about the scale and systematization of these campaigns. Some archaeologists argue that evidence points to industrial-scale processing of human remains for warfare, suggesting these weren't isolated atrocities, but systematic military pra. Others contend that the archaeological evidence is being misinterpreted, and that most human remains found at siege sites died from conventional warfare. The most controversial theory involves potential connections between medieval biological warfare and later historical atrocities. Some historians argue that the principles established during medieval human projectile campaigns provided precedents for later systematic dehumanization and biological warfare programs. Critics warn against drawing direct lines between medieval siege tactics and modern war crimes, arguing that such comparisons risk trivializing more recent atrocities. The most haunting evidence of human projectile warfare comes from the accounts of those who lived through it. Medieval chronicles preserve first-hand testimonies that provide visceral insights into the psychological reality of these campaigns. Guillaume de Nangis, a French chronicler who survived the siege of Calais in 1346, wrote detailed accounts of his experiences during English human projectile attacks. His descriptions reveal the progression from initial shock to desperate adaptation to lasting trauma. He describes how defenders initially tried to maintain normal routines, but gradually descended into survival behaviors that barely resembled human society. One particularly powerful account comes from Margaret of Flanders, who was trapped in Ghent during a siege that lasted 14 months. Her diary entries chart her psychological deterioration as human projectile attacks continued month after month. Early entries maintain hope and religious faith. Later entries become increasingly fragmented and desperate, revealing a mind struggling to process impossible horrors. Perhaps most disturbing are accounts from children who survived these attacks. A boy named Thomas, writing decades later as an adult, described watching his sister killed by a launched human head when he was 7 years old. His account reveals how child minds processed such trauma, often through elaborate fantasy explanations that help them maintain psychological stability. Medieval physicians' accounts provide clinical perspectives on trauma symptoms. Dr. Bernard de Gordon, practicing in Montpellier during the early 14th century, wrote detailed case studies of patients suffering from what he called projectile madness. His descriptions of symptoms align remarkably with modern PTSD diagnoses. Some survivor accounts reveal unexpected psychological adaptations. A few individuals developed what modern psychologists might recognize as dissociative responses, describing their experiences as if watching from outside their own bodies. These accounts provide insights into human psychological resilience under impossible circumstances. The accounts also reveal how communities attempted to maintain social structures under extreme psychological pressure. Religious leaders played crucial roles in helping survivors process their experiences within existing belief systems. Some developed theological explanations that framed the attacks as divine tests or demonic assaults, providing psychological frameworks for understanding incomprehensible events. Women's accounts are particularly valuable because they often focus on the social and familial impacts that male chroniclers overlooked. These testimonies reveal how human projectile campaigns affected child-rearing, marriage relationships, and community social bonds in ways that extended far beyond immediate military concerns. Perhaps the most chilling evidence of systematic human projectile warfare comes from surviving medieval military engineering manuals. These documents reveal that what modern minds want to dismiss as desperate barbarism was actually carefully studied military science. The most complete surviving manual is the Tractatus de Machinis Bellicis, attributed to Master Conrad of Mecklenburg, written around 1350. This technical treatise includes detailed sections on what Conrad euphemistically calls irregular projectile warfare. His clinical, mathematical approach to launching human heads reads like a nightmare version of modern military technical manuals. Conrad's manual includes calculations for adjusting trebuchet counterweights based on different types of human cargo. He provides conversion charts for transitioning between stone ammunition and human heads of various sizes. His mathematical precision in describing techniques for maximizing psychological terror is deeply unsettling. The manual also includes preservation techniques for maintaining human projectiles in combat-ready condition. Conrad describes methods for preventing decomposition, maintaining structural integrity during transport, and ensuring maximum visual impact upon delivery. These techniques read like a grotesque parody of modern military logistics manuals. Another surviving document, the Liber de Obsidione from the late 14th century, focuses specifically on psychological warfare tactics. This manual treats human projectile campaigns as one tool among many for breaking enemy morale. The author discusses timing, targeting, and escalation strategies with the same professional detachment modern military planners might use for conventional weapons. These manuals reveal that human projectile warfare wasn't improvised brutality. It was systematic military science with established best practices, standardized procedures, and institutional knowledge passed down through generations of siege engineers. The casual technical tone of these documents is perhaps more disturbing than the most emotional chronicle accounts. The manuals also reveal the international nature of these practices. Technical knowledge crossed national and cultural boundaries, suggesting that human projectile warfare was an accepted, if controversial, part of medieval military science. Engineers trained in these techniques could find employment in armies across Europe. Modern military historians studying these documents have noted striking parallels to 20th century military manuals dealing with psychological warfare and unconventional weapons. The systematic approach to dehumanization and terror, documented in medieval engineering texts, provided templates that later military theorists would recognize and, unfortunately, sometimes emulate. The Catholic Church's struggle to address human projectile warfare reveals deep tensions within medieval Christianity between practical survival and spiritual ideals. Church responses evolved over time, creating theological precedents that influenced later debates about warfare ethics. Early church responses were largely condemnatory. Pope Clement VI issued a bull in 1347, specifically denouncing the use of human remains in warfare, calling it an abomination before God and man. But enforcement was problematic. How do you excommunicate an entire army engaged in what they claim is defensive warfare? The theological complexity deepened when Christian armies began facing enemies who used these tactics. Church scholars developed sophisticated arguments about proportional response and lesser evils. If pagan armies launched human heads at Christian cities, did Christian defenders have the right to respond in kind to protect innocent lives? Thomas Aquinas's earlier writings on just war theory became focal points for these debates. Aquinas had argued that warfare could be morally justified if conducted for righteous purposes using appropriate means. But he had never anticipated the moral complexity of human projectile warfare. Later theologians struggled to apply his principles to unprecedented military realities. Some church leaders developed what might be called theological triage approaches to these dilemmas. They argued that while human projectile warfare was inherently sinful, it might be the lesser sin in situations where the alternative was allowing entire Christian populations to be slaughtered or enslaved. The emergence of military confessors reveals the Church's practical accommodation to these realities. Special priests were assigned to armies specifically to provide spiritual guidance to soldiers involved in questionable military practices. These confessors developed specialized approaches to absolving sins related to human projectile warfare. Monastic chronicles from this period reveal internal church debates about recording these events. Some monasteries refused to document human projectile campaigns, arguing that preserving such accounts might inspire future atrocities. Others maintained that honest historical records were necessary for future generations to learn from past mistakes. The long-term theological implications were profound. Medieval debates about human projectile warfare established precedents for later church positions on biological warfare, civilian targeting, and proportional response that continue to influence Catholic military ethics today. Human projectile warfare wasn't confined to any single region or conflict. Evidence suggests these tactics spread across medieval Europe and beyond through a combination of military innovation, cultural exchange, and strategic necessity. Byzantine chronicles describe similar tactics used during Ottoman sieges of Constantinople in the 14th and 15th centuries. Ottoman forces reportedly launched not just conventional human projectiles, but also specifically chosen religious figures whose deaths would maximize psychological impact on Christian defenders. Islamic military treatises from the period reveal sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare principles. The great military theorist Ibn Hudayl wrote extensively about using terror tactics to break enemy morale, including detailed discussions of projectile warfare that closely parallel European practices. Trade routes facilitated the spread of military knowledge across cultural boundaries. Siege engineers were international specialists who sold their expertise to the highest bidder. A master engineer who developed human projectile techniques in one campaign might apply the same knowledge in completely different cultural contexts months later. The Mongol Empire's military practices influenced warfare across Eurasia. Mongol siege techniques, including biological warfare using human projectiles, were adapted and modified by armies from Eastern Europe to the Middle East. The Siege of Kaffa represents just one example of broader Mongol military innovations. Crusading warfare created particularly complex dynamics around human projectile use. Christian and Muslim armies facing each other in the Holy Land both employed these tactics, creating moral paradoxes that challenged both Islamic and Christian military ethics. The international nature of medieval mercenary companies meant that knowledge of human projectile warfare spread rapidly across political boundaries. Professional soldiers who learned these techniques in one conflict would carry the knowledge to subsequent campaigns in different regions. Archaeological evidence suggests that human projectile warfare may have extended beyond Europe entirely. Sites in North Africa and Central Asia show similar patterns of human remains that could indicate comparable practices in other military traditions. The global dimensions of these practices reveal that human projectile warfare wasn't an aberration of Western military culture, but rather represented a broader pattern of military innovation that emerged independently in multiple civilizations facing similar strategic challenges. The long-term psychological consequences of human projectile warfare extended far beyond immediate military campaigns, creating lasting trauma that affected entire regions for generations. Modern trauma research provides new insights into the scope and duration of these psychological impacts. Medieval medical texts describe persistent symptoms in human projectile warfare survivors that closely match modern PTSD diagnoses. Survivors reported intrusive memories, nightmares, hypervigilance, and avoidance behaviors that could last for decades after the original trauma. Community-wide psychological effects were particularly severe. Entire cities that experienced human projectile attacks showed lasting changes in social behavior, architectural choices, and cultural practices. Many communities developed elaborate ritual practices designed to cleanse spaces where human projectiles had landed. Children exposed to these attacks often never fully recovered. Medieval accounts describe adults who decades later would become catatonic during thunderstorms because the sound reminded them of trebuchet releases they had witnessed as children. The intergenerational transmission of trauma created lasting psychological legacies. Economic recovery in affected regions was often slower than military historians might expect, based solely on physical damage. The psychological impact of human projectile campaigns appeared to create lasting inhibitions to normal commercial and social activity that persisted long after physical reconstruction was complete. Religious institutions played crucial roles in community psychological recovery. churches and monasteries developed specialized counseling approaches for trauma survivors, creating some of the earliest systematic treatments for what we now recognize as war-related PTSD. The development of survivor communities reveals adaptive psychological responses to extreme trauma. People who had experienced human projectile attacks often formed lasting bonds with other survivors, creating support networks that helped them process their experiences and maintain psychological stability. Medieval art and literature from regions affected by human projectile warfare show lasting cultural impacts. Religious art became more focused on themes of bodily integrity and resurrection. Literature developed new genres focused on survival and psychological resilience. Modern psychological research on historical trauma suggests that the effects of medieval human projectile campaigns may have influenced regional cultural development in ways that historians are only beginning to understand. The last major uses of human projectile warfare occurred during the late 15th century as medieval siege tactics gave way to gunpowder artillery. These final campaigns reveal both the ultimate evolution of the practice and the reasons for its eventual abandonment. The Siege of Rhodes in 1480 saw Ottoman forces using increasingly sophisticated human projectile techniques against Knights Hospitaller defenders. Ottoman siege engineers had perfected timing mechanisms that could cause human-filled projectiles to burst in mid-air, creating aerial displays of horror that maximized psychological impact. But the defenders' responses revealed how military culture was evolving. The Knights Hospitaller, trained as professional soldiers rather than feudal levies, showed greater psychological resilience to terror tactics. Their structured military discipline provided psychological frameworks that helped them process and manage the horror of human projectile attacks. The Siege of Granada in 1491, during the final phase of the Spanish Reconquista, marked one of the last systematic uses of human projectile warfare in Western Europe. Both Christian and Muslim forces employed these tactics, but contemporary accounts suggest they were becoming less effective as armies became more professional and better trained. Technological changes were making human projectile warfare strategically obsolete. Gunpowder artillery could breach castle walls in days rather than months, reducing the importance of lengthy psychological campaigns. The strategic value of terror tactics diminished as the speed of siege warfare increased. International diplomatic considerations were also changing. The emerging Renaissance state system placed greater emphasis on diplomatic relationships and international law. Commanders who employed extreme terror tactics faced potential diplomatic consequences that outweighed any military advantages. The rise of military professionalization meant that armies were becoming less susceptible to psychological warfare. Professional soldiers with standardized training and discipline showed greater resilience to terror tactics than the feudal militias that had dominated earlier medieval warfare. The final documented use of human projectile warfare occurred during the Ottoman siege of Vienna in 1529. By this point, the practice had become so associated with uncivilized warfare that its use actually backfired diplomatically, helping to unite European opposition against Ottoman expansion. As we reach the end of this dark journey through medieval history, we must confront an uncomfortable truth. The principles discovered by medieval siege engineers didn't disappear with the trebuchet. They evolved, adapted, and reappeared throughout subsequent military history in increasingly sophisticated forms. World War I propaganda campaigns employed psychological techniques that medieval commanders would recognize instantly. the systematic dehumanization of enemy populations, the use of graphic imagery to break civilian morale, the targeting of cultural and religious symbols. These tactics trace direct lineages back to medieval human projectile warfare. World War II saw the industrialization of psychological warfare on scales that medieval engineers could never have imagined. But the underlying principles remained the same: unpredictable terror, mortality salience, social contagion, and the systematic violation of moral boundaries to break enemy resistance. Modern terrorist organizations have studied medieval siege warfare, adapting its psychological principles to contemporary contexts. The theatrical brutality, the careful targeting of symbolic locations, the use of media to amplify psychological impact. These techniques represent direct evolution from medieval precedents. Contemporary military ethics and international law exist partly as responses to historical atrocities like human projectile warfare. The Geneva Conventions, the prohibition against biological weapons, the concepts of crimes against humanity, all represent attempts to prevent the recurrence of tactics that medieval armies pioneered. But perhaps the most important lesson from this history is recognition that ordinary people, faced with extraordinary circumstances, are capable of both unimaginable cruelty and remarkable resilience. The same human nature that allowed medieval commanders to order human heads launched from trebuchets also enabled survivors to rebuild their communities and maintain their humanity. The siege engines that fired human heads have long since rotted away. The castles they attacked have crumbled into ruins. But the psychological principles they exploited remain as relevant today as they were 700 years ago. Understanding this history doesn't just illuminate the medieval past. It helps us recognize and resist similar patterns in our own time. The next time you hear about modern atrocities, remember the trebuchets of Caffa and Orleans. Remember the engineers who calculated trajectory angles for human heads. Remember the survivors who rebuilt their shattered communities. And remember that the choice between civilization and barbarism isn't made by armies or governments or ideologies. It's made by individuals, one decision at a time, in moments when no one else is watching. The ghosts of medieval siege warfare whisper a simple warning across the centuries. The weapons may change, but human nature remains constant. The price of civilization is eternal vigilance against the darkness that lurks within our own capacity for cruelty. Perhaps that's the most important lesson these ancient trebuchets can teach us today. What other dark chapters of military history remain hidden in medieval chronicles, waiting to remind us of humanity's capacity for both evil and redemption? If this journey through the past has left you questioning the boundaries of civilized warfare, consider exploring more untold stories that shaped our world in ways we're only beginning to understand.